Hey, welcome everybody to Ex Oriente. This is a bit of an experiment for us, but before we get started, I'm one of your hosts, Eric Diamond,
I'm your other host, Jason Van Dyke.
and this is a bit of an experiment. This is something we've kind of always wanted to do. We've always wanted to do video, and it is complicated by the fact that I am here at Ex Oriente Plaza, just outside of Chicago, and Jason is halfway across the country in our nation's capital. And it's always been a problem. Like, you know, video is a bit of a sticky wicket. I mean, we were able to finally figure out Skype, and that's worked pretty well. All right, so now I have to put my phone on silent. Isn't that like the first Masonic rule?
It is.
Put your
It
damn
is.
phone on silent? Okay.
Yeah, it is.
I'm a bad Mason. All right, so
Well, hey, God bless you for that.
there you go. So it's something we've always wanted to do. We tried a bunch of different software packages and stuff like that, and we finally kind of, you know, settled on something that we think is going to work. And I know that our good friends
We
at
underlined think.
yeah, this is an experiment. Could be great, could be terrible, could be a complete train wreck. We don't know yet.
Right.
You know, our good friends at Masonic Roundtable, they've been using Hangouts, and now Hangouts is, I guess, Google YouTube live stream for a while, and that's good. But, you know, like one of the things about the show when we started doing it was that we really wanted it to be of a very high quality, and you know, we've made a lot of investments in the, you know, the sort of the production values of the show. Not that their show is not high quality; it's very high quality. It's just it doesn't give us quite the control we were looking for. And I've always been a little bit uncomfortable about our stuff living on somebody else's server. So this allows us to have a lot more granular control. So we're trying this out for the first time. We've got a bit of a learning curve, so kind of bear with us. If you're seeing this, then it was, you know, good enough to post. So what's going to happen is this is actually kind of cool, because what we're going to be able to do is create the show using video. We're going to be able to add more guests to the show. We'll be able to do panels. We'll be able to do screen sharing. It's going to be really cool. And, you know, this is something that we've been developing for quite a while, and now the pieces are finally in place, I think. So, I'm trying to think if there's anything else that we need to say about this. No, I guess that's it. Anything you want to add?
No.
Okay. So,
No, that really sounds that sounds exactly right.
cool. So, let's see what's been going on. So there's something kind of interesting that's going on, and we were checking out brother Chris Hodap's blog, otherwise known as the Masonic Newswire. But he's Freemasons for Dummies, and we'll, you know, of course, we'll put all the links in the show notes on the blog at exoriente.com. But he reported on May 2nd that the Grand Lodge of New York withdraws amity with Scotland. Now, before we get started talking about this, I have to disclose that I am both a New York Mason and a Washington, D.C. Mason, and both Grand Lodges are sort of part of this. And you work for the Grand Lodge and are a D.C. Mason. And so,
Right.
you know, we have to start by saying that our opinions are completely our own. We don't represent any position of any Grand Lodge or any Masonic body or any lodge or anything. We're just a couple of guys on a swanky new video chat, talking about stuff. So, you know, bear that in mind. And here's the thing. We're not really, you know, I don't take a real position on sort of the merits of why, why New York withdrew its recognition of Scotland, and the circumstances and the history behind it. There's a story there. Honestly, for my purposes, it don't really matter. Like, I don't, like in terms of like who's right, who's wrong, whether this is valid or meritorious or not, who knows? I don't know, but it doesn't really matter to me. Thoughts?
Yeah. Now, absolutely. And I think it is important to say that, in my professional capacity, I work for the Grand Lodge of the District of Columbia, and we are tangentially involved kind of in this issue at bar. But that being said, that anything that we talk about today is my opinion only. It has nothing to do with the Grand Lodge. It has nothing to do with any of those folks who are good enough to stand for election. I don't do that stuff. I am a hired gun. And so when I talk today, I won't divulge anything that I'm not supposed to, obviously. But my opinions are my own. And that's that.
Okay. And then, I mean, the other thing too is the reason we're bringing this up today is because this is something that's been coming up over and over and over again over the last couple of years. And, they say 3 incidents make a trend. And so this is, this is
Right.
kind of like starting to shape up like it might be a trend.
Yeah, you're 100% right. It seems like this is happening more and more. After when I joined, I mean, it was the someone not recognizing somebody else was just I'd never even heard of it really until a few years ago.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's just starting to happen more and more.
It certainly seems that way. So can you kind of summarize like so just so we understand like what
So
the chain of events was? And while you're doing that, I'm just letting people know, I'm vaping instead of smoking. So
Yeah, me too.
Please,
So-
please excuse me for that. But, I just wanted to let you know, it's not, cannabis. It's normal stuff. So,
Okay. So, let me just say this first. So, I think we should start at the very beginning. And for those of you out there who aren't Masons yet, or are, new Masons and kind of don't know what the hullabaloo is about recognition, I can kind of try and summarize that for you quickly. There is no National Grand Lodge of the United States. Each state has its own Grand Lodge that is independent of all of the others and sovereign to itself and to its state. And it shares the same relationship state by state as a state would share a relationship with the United Grand Lodge of England or the Grand Lodge of Scotland, countries that have national Grand Lodges. Now, what is recognition? Okay, well, simply put, it's kind of like how universities accredit each other. A university will say, listen, we'd like to be accredited, meaning that everyone else accepts our diploma as a real Bachelor of Arts. And generally, you have to go to an accredited college to get a degree that means something that you can put on a resume and then go get a job with. In kind of the same way, Masonry recognizes each other. Grand Lodges recognize each other as regular Masonry. And for the most part, all of the United States Grand Lodges recognize each other. The mainstream older Grand Lodges from separate countries in Europe and wherever, those are kind of all in that same recognition stew. Every year at the Conference of Grand Masters of North America, there is a recognition committee that gets together. That committee takes in credentials from groups, other Grand Lodges, newer Grand Lodges that want to be recognized. And then they kind of collect all the information and they say, well, this is generally how we do it in the past. Does that Grand Lodge conform to all of the kind of the older promises that we've made. We're a fraternity, so men only. Do they believe in God? Do all their members believe in God?
And those are the Masonic landmarks, right?
Right. That's exactly right. So, do they adhere to those landmarks? And then after they do that, they say, all right, well, let's have a little history about your Grand Lodge. Like, where did you come from? Did you offshoot from a different Grand Lodge? Things like that. And they take all that information and then they present it to the group that's there at the Conference of Grandmasters, and then they vote. And that vote's non-binding. It's just a recommendation, and that recommendation then is passed along to the individual Grand Lodges to make up their own minds on whether they're going to recognize this new Grand Lodge or not. So, for example, last year, the Grand Lodge of Liechtenstein presented to the group, and they were not recognized. And some of the reason there was that there were questions about how they had started that Grand Lodge. To start a Grand Lodge is just like starting a lodge or petitioning for membership in a lodge, as it were. You've got to get two sponsors. The two sponsors that Liechtenstein went and got themselves were a little odd. They were sponsored by a Canadian Grand Lodge and Grand Lodge of Mexico, one of the state Grand Lodges in Mexico, which was an odd pairing, considering that Liechtenstein is kind of jammed between Germany and France and a couple other countries. And those other countries kind of went, hey, why have we never heard of you before? You should have come to us. I mean, we're right next door. And so that kind of set off the alarm bells for people. And there were some other things that were in their application that folks had questions about. And so they were the recommendation from the committee was not to recognize. Now, again, that's non-binding. It goes to the states. They make up their minds. They do whatever they want. In that recognition can also be taken away. And that's the situation that we find ourselves with today in New York, where they have pulled their recognition with the Grand Lodge of Scotland. And I'll let Eric summarize it. Eric, you're a better summarizer of those things than I.
Yeah. So basically, just to kind of add on to kind of what you were saying. So this idea of recognition, right, gets you certain benefits. And one of those benefits is called amity. And what amity means is that, a Mason from one jurisdiction, who's a member of one, whose lodge is a constituent of one Grand Lodge, is allowed to visit a lodge in another territory. So, for example, before I became a plural member in DC, and that's another benefit that you have when you have amity, right, is that I can join lodges in other grand jurisdictions, provided that we're all on good terms with each other.
Correct.
If my Grand Lodge allows plural membership, which they do. So
and many do.
Yeah, and so that's a very important benefit of recognition is amity. The other thing is that we recognize that a Master Mason from one is treated as a Master Mason in another. So if I go to another jurisdiction and visit and say that I'm a Master Mason, I'm treated as a Master Mason. And it can get kind of different when you go to countries where we have amity with them, but they have a different system. So, for example, if you are a 32nd degree Scottish Rite Mason and you go to a Scandinavian country to visit a Scandinavian lodge, they treat you very differently than if you're just a 3rd degree Mason, because they have a different system. Right. So
they have an integrated system.
Yeah, they have an integrated system,
which is a show for a different time.
That's a show for a different day, right? So, so that's the idea of amity. So when they withdraw recognition, they're withdrawing amity, and basically what that means is that when a Grand Lodge pulls recognition between one Grand Lodge and another, first of all, it can sometimes go one way. So sometimes, like, if the Grand Lodge of Eric and decides that he's not going to recognize the Grand Lodge of Jason anymore, it can go one way. So Jason can continue to recognize the Grand Lodge of Eric, or it can be, usually what happens is it's mutual.
We
right?
we never had a problem with the Grand Lodge of Eric, and all of a sudden it just comes out of nowhere. But
That's right.
Hey, Eric is fleeting.
I forgive
He
easily.
does those things.
I forgive easily. But
Which is nice.
yeah. But so it can be one way, but most often, it's kind of like diplomacy. Like if you recall your ambassadors from one country, they generally recall ambassadors from the other country, and now you don't have diplomatic relations, which means you don't have ambassadors, you don't have visitation between countries. It becomes really, it's sort of like the United States and Cuba or the United States and North Korea, right? We don't have formal relations with them, and so it makes it harder to kind of communicate and things like that. So
It's just like diplomacy, except you can't get out of your parking tickets and things like that because of immunity.
well, yeah, and here's and this is kind of what's germane to this show today, is that there's no diplomats go to school to learn how to do diplomacy, and it's a very
Right. No, that's true.
right.
Nuanced.
It's a very nuanced process, and there's a lot of protocol, and there's a lot of stuff that you do,
Yes.
and
100%.
And so here's what happened. So there's been this kind of long running thing going on in between New York and Washington, those two Grand Lodges, where New York for many years now has operated lodges overseas that are sort of like you can kind of think of them as sort of like Masonic colonies, right? So and there's a doctrine among Grand Lodges called territorial sovereignty, which means that once a Grand Lodge is the dominant Grand Lodge in an area, you can't start other Grand Lodges inside of it without that Grand Lodge's permission. So the Grand Lodge of Illinois, its jurisdiction is the borders of the state of Illinois, and you can't just start your own Grand Lodge inside of it and expect anybody to recognize it, right? And so
And conversely, the Grand Lodge of Illinois can't just plop a lodge in Indiana and say, well, but this lodge is ours,
right,
not yours.
right, and it normally it works that way, but there are these certain kind of gray areas, and those include countries where traditionally there are no Grand Lodges. So, for example, South Korea, right? So I travel a lot to South Korea for business. There's no Grand Lodge of South Korea. So, if I want to go visit a lodge there, I believe there is one lodge in Seoul that is under the Grand Lodge of Scotland, right? So it's chartered under the Grand Lodge of Scotland. So there are these little pockets of Masonic lodges around the world that are under the Grand Lodge of England or Scotland or New York or places like that. And so,
Although oddly enough, Eric, real quick, in South Korea is actually the southern jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite of the United States.
Really?
It is.
I did not know
Yep.
that.
It is. It is. It's part of the southern jurisdiction.
Oh, okay. So,
Odd but true.
yeah, okay. So and it wouldn't surprise me to find that there were more than one lodge there, or like whatever. But suffice it to say that at some point, and I'm not entirely clear on the nitty and the gritty, but at some point, some guys in Washington started a lodge in Lebanon, and this is about, I don't know, I want to say like 7 or 8 years ago this happened.
About 2007 or 2008.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah,
I think it was 2007 when it first started.
yeah. So some guys went over to Lebanon and started a lodge there, and New York already had lodges in Lebanon and got
As did the Grand Lodge of Scotland.
as did the Grand Lodge of Scotland, and hang on a sec, I just have to check something real quick. Yeah, and so they basically the Grand Lodge of New York said to the Grand Lodge of Washington, cease and desist, close this lodge down. Washington said no, New York said yes, and then they for a time withdrew recognition, and then at some point the Grand Master in Washington changed, and they had a new guy come in, and they said, all right, let's sit down and make peace, and and they made peace. And part of the terms of that peace is that the guys who had started this lodge were to be expelled for unmasonic conduct, and that was done, and everything was kind of fine for a while. And then somehow, according to this article, so I'll just I'll read parts of it. Brother Hodep says, at that time, the Grand Lodge of the District of Columbia chartered a new lodge, Ahiram Lodge number 1000, in the Middle Eastern nation of Lebanon, where the GLs of both Scotland and New York already had lodges, along with several others. So after back-channel negotiations, after this, withdrawing of recognition from each other, the new DC Lodge remained in operation, and amity between New York and DC were quickly restored in February of 2009. But the guys, the real bone of contention was not so much that these guys opened a lodge, but these guys had been former members of the Grand Lodge of New York who were expelled.
Well, they had demitted.
Okay.
They demitted
right.
from the
Okay.
Grand Lodge.
Yes.
They demitted from the Grand Lodge in New York, and placed their demit with, I believe, an Italian Grand Lodge, and from there, they ended up in Grand Lodge of Scotland.
Right. Yeah. Here's the problem. The problem is that the Grand Lodge of New York has a rule on its books that once you're a New York Mason, you are perpetually under the jurisdiction of the Grand Lodge of New York, no matter who else you belong to. And this is something that now affects me because I'm also a New York Mason. So,
as I've explained to Eric before, this is called the Hotel California rule.
So so this was the
anytime you like, but
you can never leave.
Never leave.
Yeah.
Right.
So so basically what happened was they regarded these Masons as expelled Masons, and demanded that Washington, the Grand Lodge of Washington, expel them too. And as part of this brokered peace deal, that happened, right? So these guys were expelled, and somehow they went. It says, let's see, it says here, they left the Lebanon Lodge and briefly were members of the Grand Lodge of Italy, and eventually became members in a Scottish Constitution Lodge in Lebanon. So now you've got these guys who were New York Masons, are now considered by New York to be expelled Masons. You've got these same three guys who are now expelled by Washington, so they're under kind of a double expulsion.
They were never expelled by Washington. I believe they demitted from Washington.
They did. Okay, so it was a sort of a resign rather than be fired. Okay, all right, that's fine.
Correct.
Good. Yep. I stand corrected then. And so these guys are now members of a Scottish lodge, and again, New York, again regards them as not legit Masons, and I think kind of demanded that went to Scotland and said, hey, these guys are expelled, and this is a very important aspect of sort of the principles of recognition and amity, which is that
right.
if the Grand Lodge of Eric expels a Mason, he can't run over the border to the Grand Lodge of Jason and sign up, right? That's
right.
not how it works. So we honor, just as we honor each other's degrees, when somebody gets expelled, we also honor that expulsion, and
Correct.
and we work, like that. So the Grand Lodge of Scotland, however, basically, I'm just sort of paraphrasing.
So essentially what the Grand Lodge of Scotland said was, listen, they demitted. You expelled them, after the fact, and so, but they had demitted. They were free before you did before you took any Masonic action, legal Masonic action. They had demitted and they were gone. So, they were fine to us, and they remain good Masons, and we stand by them. And New York said no. Once a New York Mason, always a New York Mason. You can't demit. You can withdraw, whatever, but you're always under our control. So therefore, no, you need to honor the expulsion. And the Grand Lodge of Scotland feels very much that's an incorrect path, and that is it's. I've heard the word.
Wait, are you telling me that the Scots don't like to be told what to do?
Oddly enough, being the oldest Grand Lodge in the world, they don't take kindly to orders.
Yeah.
And I believe they've used the word immoral, and so they've just said no. And as far as I know, the Grand Lodge in New York has pulled their recognition from Scotland, and Scotland has said nothing.
Yeah. So basically, tensions are running high, and the Grand Lodge of New York, in response, has pulled amity. Now, here's where this gets kind of interesting for me: is that there seems to have been a lot of things like this happening, where you have, like a couple years ago, we had issues. We saw issues in West Virginia,
Right.
and or what was it? Was it Arkansas? And guys were going to Oklahoma.
No, 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 no,
No. What
yes.
was that?
Yes, it was. It was Arkansas and Oklahoma.
Yeah.
You're
So
100% right.
yeah. So there was the great brouhaha in the Grand Lodge of Arkansas, and guys were demitting from Arkansas and running over the border to Oklahoma, and the problem is that this it kind of goes around this idea of territorial sovereignty, where you had guys living in Arkansas who were Masons in Oklahoma, and
Right.
and that was kind of a problem. So we've seen, it seems like, a lot of this, some people in Masonry call it the nuclear option, right? Because really, when you think about it, that's, Masons don't go to war, right? We don't fight with each other. We don't,
Right.
raise fists. So if you're one Grand Lodge and you've got, you want to, get at the other Grand Lodge, that's pretty much your ultimate lever, is to pull recognition.
Right.
Because it's kind of like, if you think of it like the church, right? So the Catholic Church has two basic weapons at its disposal, right? They can excommunicate somebody who's in the church. And basically what that means is that when you're excommunicated, you can't receive any of the sacraments, and you're not supposed to be allowed in churches, and all good Catholics are supposed to shun you and things like that. But the Pope also has another weapon up his sleeve called interdict, which basically puts an entire country under the sentence of excommunication. And popes don't do this really anymore, but they did it in the Middle Ages in order to get kings to put, like, if you're in a Catholic country, if you're the King of France, right, and the Pope puts all of France under interdict, that makes for a lot of unhappy Catholics who are going to try to put pressure on the king to, see things the Pope's way. So that's kind of what this nuclear option, this withdrawing of amity is kind of about. And one of the, I wanted to call attention to one of the comments. There's a lot of, it's really interesting. There's a lot of varied comments. On one end, you get people who say, we shouldn't even be discussing this in public, right? But, I feel like first of all, we kind of have to discuss it in public. We don't have to discuss it in public, but I feel like it's appropriate to discuss it because to try to understand how to put it in context and kind of what's going on with it. There is, and this actually does affect people, right? So for example, as a New York Mason, I cannot go to Scotland. If I were planning to go for the 300th anniversary of
Right.
Freemasonry, and they wanted to take a trip up to, Mother Kilwinning Lodge or whatever, I could not attend that. So,
Nope.
So it's a pretty serious, it has implications for people who are members of one or the other Grand Lodge. And just to kind of put a fine point on it, before, like right now, I'm a member of 3 lodges: my Mother Lodge in Chicago, a lodge in New York, IRA number 2, and a Washington Lodge, Union number 6. And when Washington and New York were having this problem, I mean, it was before I was a Mason in either of those lodges, but when that happened, there were guys who, it was the guys who were members of both states, simultaneously, who had a really, really hard time. And it really does affect people. So it's something that
in Washington and New York have a lot of crossover.
Yeah, of course. Right. So there was a really interesting, a guy who goes by the name of, let's see. So a guy by the name of Dave Brown signs this thing, Dave Brown. He says, I'm sorry to keep repeating myself, but I just can't get over how these grandmasters choose to use their authority, the kinds of things they're willing to suspend recognition for, and the things they won't take action about. When the Grand Master of Florida suddenly declared that certain religions don't count as believing in God simply because he said so, and that any Florida Masons found to be practicing them would be brought to trial with a predetermined outcome, those of us who demanded suspension of relations with the Grand Lodge of Florida were told, oh no, we couldn't do that. We have Masons from our own Grand Lodge living down there. Where would they go? When the Grand Master of West Virginia expelled his predecessor because he had a cup of coffee with his Prince Hall counterpart, and another Grand Lodge took him in, the Grand Lodge of West Virginia threatened to suspend relations unless he was re-expelled, and all of us sat silent as the Grand Lodge of West Virginia got its way. And then he goes on, to gives a couple of other examples, the Grand Lodge of Tennessee, with the Gates Mason being expelled, Grand Master of Georgia, and then which provoked a withdrawal of recognition, and I think a limited withdrawal of amity, which by the several Grand Lodges, and I think is Washington still one of them?
No. So okay. Washington withdrew fraternal relations, which is basically just like we didn't pull recognition. We pulled relations, which means we
so it's official stuff.
Taking our ambassadors,
right?
It's like taking our ambassadors back, and they responded with official pulling of recognition from Tennessee. So Tennessee doesn't recognize DC.
Got it. Okay. So. Sometimes
Georgia and Georgia and DC are at a quiet stalemate.
And here's the thing, for like a normal Joe on the street like us, it's hard to keep track of all this stuff. Like who's
It is. It's hard to keep your finger on it, and it's very much inside baseball stuff. Very much. It's the things that come out to the quote unquote public really only come down to a certain audience of the public, and that's people who read Hodep's blog, listen to lots of podcasts that have sort of an eye on what's going on around the country or around the world, and so it's a small audience. I mean, most Masons won't know nor care in the United States that any of this stuff is happening.
Right.
Because it just doesn't really affect them. So, yeah, it's kind of interesting. It is a tempest in a teapot in a lot of ways.
Yeah. So let's go back to Dave Brown because I want to get to kind of his point.
Absolutely.
He says,
Sure.
but over something so petty and meaningless, a grandmaster is willing to take the most severe action possible. All of a sudden, the collateral damage from suspending recognition, all the innocent Masons living in that other jurisdiction that suddenly find themselves unable to visit lodges there, is a price that's worth paying. All of a sudden, sovereignty doesn't matter. The fallout from suspension of recognition is too severe when these other Grand Lodges also practice bigotry, but it's not too severe when they give a promotion to someone that another Grand Master views as a personal slight against him. That's pretty strong. That's a strong cup of coffee there. And
it really is. It really is. And let's all be really frank about this. In my opinion, he's 100% right.
It's certainly,
it's a fact.
It certainly seems that way. And I think, part of it is that you have, and this is really what I wanted to do on this show, is not so much, kind of, revel in the Schadenfreude or anything like, like that's not,
Right.
I feel for all these guys. And I even feel for the Grand Lodges because it's hard. What interests me about this topic is what are the things underlying it? So like one of the things that I do is as a strategist, I look at in marketing and social media and all this stuff. I say, what's happening and why is it happening? And try to understand the forces underlying it. And I think that there's a couple of interesting things at play here. One of them, I think, is the fact that a grandmaster has a very limited term, right?
Yes.
Typically in the United States, it's 2 years, sometimes 1 year.
It's 1 year, sometimes 2.
Yeah. And so, if something like this is going to happen, if someone is going to kind of, get all up in a grandmaster's grill, it's kind of hard to sit it out for your year and not have taken action. And that tarnishes your legacy as a grandmaster. And so I kind of understand why they're so quick to take up arms, if you will, and really kind of make this a cause celeb.
Right.
I think another thing is sort of generational, right? In that back when our country was founded and we were trying to figure out, I think the story goes, and I don't know if it's true or not, but the story goes that, the Masons came to George Washington and said, we want to make you our Grand Master of the United States. And George Washington, basically being George Washington, said, nothing doing, I might be a Grand Master of Virginia, but, we just got rid of one king. I don't want to start become another one. Instead, it was decided that we should make the states sovereign, individual Grand Lodges. And at a time when most people lived and died in the same town, that was fine. And my guess is that most people didn't even know about, if one state pulled recognition from another. Most Masons in that state would never be affected by it. They might never hear about
Right.
it. It would be like the correspondence committee of
Right. It probably never happened, Eric, because what would the consequences be, right? The only time that you that you do something is to get consequences, right? And so it would be a moot point to pull recognition back when your Masons weren't traveling and their Masons weren't traveling into each other's jurisdictions. It wouldn't matter, right?
Mm-hmm.
So who cares? But that soon changed, I mean, you give it 100 years and there's easy travel from state to state, especially on the East Coast, where the distances were shorter. And that's when you start seeing, oh, this is a power. I have power. Okay. And when you've got limited time, unfortunately, some people get in there and they've got that limited time and they know that they have a small window in which to use their power, and so they use it. And again, I think it goes back to a point that you made much earlier, which is these people are not trained in diplomacy. These people are not, they have no formalized training whatsoever in dealing with other people and conflicting viewpoints. They have no conflict resolution in their background. We're lucky if we even get an attorney. And that just means that they know how to argue their side of the case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Not that they know how to get to a solution
Right.
from that argument. So, it's a difficult situation, and we're a bunch of amateurs. The thing that catches me a lot when I read these things, and I've become an incredibly cynical Mason, because I know how the sausage is made, and when I read these things, I can't help but think to myself, like, guys, it's not that hard to be nice to each other and to sit down and have an adult conversation. When I disagree with you, we sit down, we have a conversation, and we say, all right, can we come to a resolution? All right, well, we can't. Well, where does that leave us? And the thing is that the one of the main tenets, what we're taught in our ritual is not to be zealots. Is to be measured.
Yeah, to
In
subdue
our
our passions,
interactions
right?
with each other, and it drives me nuts to watch this stuff because it sickens me. And here's the other thing, is that when we really boil it down, right?
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of big problems in this world, big horrible things that are going on that need solving, and instead, a bunch of guys who play dress up on the weekends decide that they're going to fight with each other in a passive aggressive, crappy little way. And that's disheartening. That's the part that gets me. Is that
Yeah.
it always comes back to, you realize that like you're the president of a dress up club for men, and you're only going to be here for a year. Right?
Well, I can't be that cynical about it. I mean, I get a lot more value out of masonry than that. And and frankly, I don't
You
really
can.
dress up.
You absolutely can. Don't take me that way.
Yeah.
But let's boil it down. Let's look at the big picture of this thing, right? The big picture really says, come on, you might be taking this a little too seriously.
Well,
You
all right.
know?
So wait, sorry. So you bring up an interesting point, which is I think one of the other aspects of this, right? Which is that we are fighting over a dwindling pie.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So the stakes are much higher, right? You know, when everybody had plenty of Masons, I mean, if you look at Arkansas's rate of decline, right?
Right.
They've got a serious membership demographic / whatever problem. To have people that they feel are a threat to their way of doing things, right? It's a much more major threat when you have that many fewer Masons. Right. And I think what happens is when people get anxious, right, there are certain personalities that feel like they have to control things, and are loath to give up that control. And we see this all the time in Masonry where,
Yes.
there's a whole, I've got to control this because if I don't control it, people are going to blame me. Like, no, it's funny, but when you talk to people in grand lines, right? And you talk to people when they're low down on the grand line, they say things like, "Oh, well, we of course we should have smaller masonry. Of course, what's the big deal? Why are we so focused on membership?" But then you get into that chair in the East, in the Grand East, and all of a sudden you don't want to be the guy who pulls charters for half the lodges in your state because they're defunct. Right. You don't want to be that guy who goes down in history as like the butcher of, Illinois or something like that. I don't blame these guys. I mean, I can't, I certainly wouldn't want to think about it. You work 14 years to get up the Grand Line, something like that.
In a lot of places. Yeah. It takes a long time.
Yeah. And I know from I have a couple of friends who have been grandmasters, and, most worshipful Joe Crociata, right? He was grandmaster of and a good friend of mine. Now, granted, visiting all the lodges in DC is not like you're the grandmaster of Texas and you're visiting all the lodges in Texas, right?
Well, you don't have to travel far, but you still have to visit 43 lodges.
Yeah.
And one in Lebanon.
Right.
It's still a huge time sink.
Sure.
It is a massive investment of your time.
And
massive.
I remember, if you go back in the archives of Ex Oriente, I interviewed David Miller, who was Grandmaster of Illinois, and these are guys who put like 100,000 miles on their car.
That's right.
During their term, it's a serious commitment, and you don't want to be that guy who's gonna have a tarnished legacy.
The craziest part about this, Eric, is that there are men who sacrifice their marriages to be grandmaster. That's how much of a time suck this thing is. It's all encompassing for a lot of these guys. And if you look at it, like let's take two states in particular that I'm thinking of right now, Texas and California. Can you imagine? I mean, California, I don't know how many Masons they've got there, but it's probably over 90,000. That's a lot of people.
It's a lot of people. It's a lot of people. Yeah.
In Texas, they because of the way that they catalog their membership, They have a guesstimate. They have a good guesstimate, but they don't know exactly what their membership is. But their guesstimate is at 75,000 plus. That's huge, and the area in which they stretch to is enormous.
Right.
So, I mean, being Grand Master of a state like that has just got to be ultra stressful because you've got so many competing interests. You know, you think of the founding of our country. The founding of our country is the earliest and the immediate conflict in our country was cities versus country, right? It was our urban centers versus our agrarian production centers. And those interests were not aligned. They never have been, they never will be. And the big conflicts that we had, federalism, anti-federalism, all stem from that conflict of, city folk versus country folk.
And it's still with us.
Now, right, and now you put a Grand Master, right, and you put him as the head of an organization that stretches for their whole state, and one like Texas, which has, I'd call it 2 major cities and 3, second tier cities, San Antonio. San Antonio, Austin, and Waco would be kind of second tier. They're good sized cities, but you've got Dallas and Houston, just powerhouse, huge cities.
And Austin.
And right, well, Austin's not huge. It's secondary, I think.
But it's different.
But I mean,
culturally, it's Austin's a
You're
little weird.
100% right.
Right.
But the thing is that now balance that and say, all right, well, did their interests win over whatever the guy in Plano is thinking of? No. What about the guy in Lukenbach? And so it's really tough.
Yeah.
That has got to be a really stressful job. And
Sure.
again, let's go back to this. There is no formal training for this. Mm-hmm. You are expected to sit in the CEO's chair, the president of the board of directors, and you're supposed to be, this charismatic leader, and you're also supposed to be an incredibly effective administrator, and manager that understands, the long-term strategic plan of a lumbering organization. It's unrealistic.
Yeah.
And it's unfair what we do to these guys, and it's unfair the responsibility that we put on their shoulders.
Yeah, and just to point out too,
that in a lot of ways,
other Grand Lodges too have managed this, have dealt with it they do hire professional management, and their their Grand Mastership is largely ceremonial. Like they're not sort of operationally, and they have consistency. I don't think we've gotten there in the U.S. yet, but we should point that out.
Well, California kind of does. They kind of sort of do.
But that's recent,
California, isn't it? Yeah, the Grand Secretary there is a professional, is a hired professional who acts as an executive director of a very large nonprofit. Mm-hmm. They've got an office staff in the Grand Lodge of California of like 30 or 40 people, which is insane compared to the Washington, D.C. massive lumbering staff of 2, plus the Grand Secretary. It's crazy. It's absolutely crazy.
So there's two other things that I think are worth pointing out that kind of also contribute to this sort of phenomenon. One is the effect that the internet has on all this, right? So one of the things that's really interesting about the nature of the internet, there's a very good article. If I can find it, I'll put a link on the show notes to it. Called "We Are Our Own Worst Enemy" by Clay Shirky. Now, Clay Shirky is I don't even know what his background is. He's like a marketing guy, social scientist, but he was one of the first writers on sort of how the internet affects people socially, and he wrote a really good article about how internet groups, they're very they really there's this phenomenon that happens where people like, because you're disintermediated, right? Because you're not seeing face to face, because you're not picking up emotional cues, people get outraged way more quickly and way more easily. And we see that all over the place. We see it on Twitter, we see it on Facebook, we see it with trolling and stuff like that. And I think, the younger generations, and this is something that's been documented, have fewer and fewer skills at sort of delving into sort of emotional intelligence. And what I mean by that is that, like, when I look at you face to face, right, I'm picking up a lot of body language, right? I'm picking up a lot of like, tone of voice and stuff like that. But
right. It's not nonverbal cues.
Yeah, but when everything is being said through text, people have a tendency to kind of read the worst into it, not the best into it. And this is one of the things that I think Freemasonry as an institution really has something to teach us, right? Because with few exceptions, there are no internet lodges, right? And in my opinion, there shouldn't be, right? It should be a face-to-face. It should be an emotional kind of thing. So the effect of the internet is basically as a sort of a multiplier. Excuse me. It's sort of a multiplier. It's sort of a it can make what start out as really small things become very, very large, just because it gets communicated a lot. The other thing, and then I want to hear what you think about this, is that we're way, way, way more mobile than we ever were. I mean, when the Grand Lodge of Arkansas does something, or the Grand Lodge of the Grand Master issues an edict or something like that, it is all over the world in hours, in literally hours. And it also means that we can travel like people couldn't ever travel. I mean, I get on a plane, several times a year. And in fact, this January, I literally went around the world. I started in Chicago, right, went to Paris, went from Paris to Seoul, went from Seoul to Chicago. I went around the globe. That's routine for a lot of people right now. So this idea of traveling, it affects more people, and we're exposed to more kinds of people than I think people were, back in maybe 100, 150 years ago. And so I think both of those, sort of the speed at which things happen, and the fact that today's man is likely to change careers 3 times now, and they're likely to move out of state at least a couple of times in their absolutely. Lifetime, which means that they're going to be, we had a guy who was a physician, who was a member of our lodge, African-American guy, and he went to Louisiana. And all of a sudden, people were assuming he was Prince Hall, and he joined a lodge, and I'm proud to say he became the first African American master of a Grand Lodge of Louisiana Lodge in That's history. Awesome. Right? It's great, and it says that things are changing. But what it means also is that we have what constitutes sort of deep tradition and culture in one jurisdiction, like in Arkansas or Georgia or something like that. When it gets out into the bigger world, where we're, maybe there are other places which are a little more cosmopolitan, like I know Washington is and California is and places like that. And this is something that's also affecting our country as a whole, right? But when when those kinds of things get out, right, people have opinions, and they're not afraid to share them, and it can create a lot of friction.
Yeah, absolutely. And and I think that it all boils down to communication, right? It's how we communicate with each other. And again, I think that that's where Freemasonry has a lot to teach us. It shows us how to best communicate, with people that we're supposed to respect and that we're supposed to love, and I think there's not enough pause button, well, maybe I shouldn't do this. I think you're right. I think it's the world has sped up greatly because of the internet and how we communicate these days. Unfortunately, our brains haven't sped up like that, and so we aren't able to think through a response. If you go back into a lot of the historical stuff, and like letters from Grand Masters, or where I used to work at the Scottish Rite, the Grand Commander, and you read these old letters. They're letters that were sent back and forth to each other over the period of weeks. right? And so, one person would say something, and then a week, maybe two later, you'd get a response. And they were just as ornery, and they were just as passive aggressive.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
But the thing is that they had a lot of time to perfect the message that they were going to send back and forth. There was no rush to do it in a text that was instantaneous. There was no, it wasn't a face-to-face conversation. And so I think that we ought to slow things down a little bit. There's nothing wrong with that. And in an organization as old as ours, slowing it down is always a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, I see that. I also wonder. I wonder if there isn't also a, we've been talking a lot about social relevance, right? Like,
right.
I'm sort of thinking of the phrase, the devil makes work of idle hands, right? And I'm wondering if because we don't have a great purpose that's uniting us forward, it becomes much easier to fight about stuff that doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things.
Right. It's a lot. What is it? Is it? I apologize for all of you people out there, the learned people, but I think it was von Clausewitz who said that peace was the greatest motivator for war, and that's that. When you don't have something to unite you, when you don't have that one common enemy, little things become much bigger. And that could be, where we are now, is that, we've had a great peace for a long time. And now it's, there's the restlessness. There's the idle hands that you talked about.
So what are we as Masons? What's our takeaway? How are we to, so we read stuff like this in Masonic blogs, and I'm sure, like, there'll be other podcasts that talk about this, and other, this will be a topic of discussion in, after lodge taverns all over the place. But
yeah, I mean, honestly, I think that the only thing that we can do is individually, the only thing that we can do is just try and, live our lives as an example of what should be done, right? Don't be a jerk. It's as simple as that. Be nice. Try to understand other people's viewpoints and their positions, and then be quiet about it. You don't have to, getting on a soapbox. If you ever hear that guy that gets up in lodge and gets on the soapbox and rants and raves about some great injustice, you're not convincing me, because I'll hear you out, but you're not doing it in an effective way. Quiet, deliberate thought and conversation. That's what wins the day.
So
I think that you can only do that individually. Mm-hmm. Unless there are people out there that have ambition to the Grand Lodge, and God bless you. And if you do, my biggest piece of advice to you is to listen a lot and learn, and be very, very slow to anger. And it's the only thing that you can do. I mean, I'm a terrible example of that. But it's so difficult, because I think that to say, like, well, we can effectuate change in our Grand Lodges and blah blah blah. You're limited in that opportunity. And so the best thing that you can do is, on an individual basis, just go out and try and be the best Mason you can. Actually try and practice what was taught to you. That's it. It's as simple as that. Even though that's a tall order, it's a simple order. It's a difficult follow through.
Yeah, I would go a little bit further than that. I think that, because that one could read into that, if one were of a certain mindset, that if you take it to its extreme, it could almost be like, oh, stop paying attention to this and go learn a lecture, or go
Right.
Right. I think we can do more. And I think what we need to do is first of all, I think we as Masons you know, when recognizing our purpose for being in Masonry, right, which is to subdue our passions and improve ourselves, right, is A, speak not to convince, right?
Yeah, there you go.
Persuade, but don't, like you could, someone once told me you can be right or you can be happy, but you can't be both, right? And, right?
Yeah.
Right. So
buy
I
that.
think, I think that, there are big issues that are facing Masonry, right? We are at a decline. There is racism. There is sexism. There is,
Yeah.
there is homophobia. There are a lot of, look, we're not immune to the social issues that are going on in our country. Right. But when you speak to understand, not to convince, not to be sanctimonious, not to get on your soapbox. Right. There's a, I hear all the time about, people railing against this grandmaster, that grandmaster. I know grandmasters, and I know that they worry, they keep up at night. There are multiple sides to everything, and I'm not saying that everybody's right. I'm not saying. It's funny that we're doing this show for the very first time, and we're doing it, kind of like side by side, almost like, Crossfire
Right.
or something like that. It doesn't have to be like that, right? There is
No.
right and there is
Right.
wrong, and we shouldn't just sort of be like morally relativistic and say, well, he thinks that and he thinks that, and it's all a good world. It's not. It doesn't need to be like that, right? But if we start from a position of respect. Right. And when we negotiate, not negotiate based on position, but negotiate based on needs. Right. If I were the Grand Lodge of Scotland, like the Grand Master of Scotland, or the Grand Master of New York, the first thing that I would be trying to understand is, what does the other guy need? What does he need to get out of this mess? Right? And how far can I go to meet that need? And if both of them do that, I guarantee you this will be a very short brouhaha, and hopefully it won't happen again. I think it's when people like dig in their heels, and this is why, like, just to kind of delve into scratch the surface of politics. I think that's why we're in such a mess right now with our political discourse, is because we have media, we have social media, right? We have this idea of the bubble effect, which we'll talk about in another show, right? And it allows us to sort of be in our little righteous bubble, and everybody outside of that righteous bubble is wrong, and is them, and is the out group, and is the enemy, and we need to defeat that, and that is not what Masonry is about. That is, like, to me, Masonry is about understanding people who are different than you, and doing it over a common set of experiences.
Correct. I agree 100%. And honestly, right there, that's the perfect last thought, because it is 100%. That's exactly it. You couldn't have said it better.
Cool. So this, I had a really good time with this. It's very different for me. I promise next time I'll dress better. Maybe I'll, comb my hair a little bit better, and I got to clean up my
I make
office.
No such
and
promises.
maybe get a screen or something, and it'll get better as we go. But this is kind of an interesting experiment. So the next thing I've got to figure out is how to, my guess is, let's see, is that this file is going to be enormous. 35 gigabytes. So I've got to figure out how to compress this in a way that makes it viewable and stuff. And then, we'll put it, on the feed, and see how we can get this, uploaded. And then what we're going to do is, as we do this, we're going to start doing this regularly, and we're going to do it live. So you'll be able to participate. We'll, the next thing is, like, once we get the bugs worked out of this video thing, we're going to start a chat room so that you guys can join us. And then we're also going to be, streaming this on Facebook Live. So you'll be able to participate live, over Facebook Live, and that'll be really interesting.
Hot takes.
So yeah. So stay tuned, and thanks for staying with us. And anything else before we go?
No. Hey, thanks, guys. Appreciate it. And thanks for watching us in a whole variety of different ways in the last few months.
Cool. All right. Well, take care, everybody.
Thanks, guys.